Hey everyone, Sunyveil here, and before we get started with episode 40 of FECast, part 2 of Building the Tournament-Winning Decklist, I have a few quick announcements. First off, congratulations to Apple Chips for taking down the ECQ Festival of Inspiration this past weekend, playing a Destruction Shrine deck, besting ZDCH, a longtime tournament player, in the finals. And second, the draft championship is this weekend, the long-awaited draft championship that's going to have, well, the most competitive drafts that we've ever seen. And I'm really excited for it. I'm going to be playing in it. We don't have much preparation for that, but if you are interested, you can check out the draft summit I did with Kolebovich and Cassandrith. I'll be linking that in the description. Just a heads up, there have been some changes to the draft format since we released that, so keep that in mind. For one, I don't think that the factions are as imbalanced as they were. Justice, for example, lost one of its best commons, or at least it shows up in a much decreased frequency. And the other thing I'd like to point out is that the curated packs are very weak, and I think that what that's going to lead to is decks that go big and are kind of clunky but have powerful things going on. I think those are going to perform better than they have in the past with this format. So keep that in mind for all those participating in the event this weekend. As always, FECast is made possible by our generous patrons at patreon.com. If you are interested in supporting the show and making this possible, you can check us out at patreon.com/Friends of Eternal. Huge shout out to Cotillion, Ryder, Alcide Bava, Sigmund Tank, Work Done Son, Chamomilk, Chris Ye, D-Dub, and Yeast Out for their continued support of the show. And without any further ado, let's get into episode 40 of FECast, the second part of Building the Tournament-Winning Decklist with Batteriez. All right, so the other way you can win is a lot less exciting, and that's just having good cards. So I think an example of this is anytime anyone does well with Winchest, I say that as presumably Stormblessed is typing this. Another good example of this, I think, is when Lights Out Ace won the ECQ with Argenport. I don't remember if it was an ECQ specifically, but won his spot to Worlds with Argenport because that was just the most effective cards in the format put together in a very efficient way. And I think that efficiency is really key here when you're trying to play a deck that plays good cards.
Yeah, I mean, another example from the recent past that, almost all listeners should remember is a Chonky Crag, right? The Chonky Scry Crag, just playing a bunch of X5 bodies, right? There's not really the synergy there that's inherent in like Cultist. There's just kind of, it's playing a bunch of X5 bodies, and that ended up being really good in the metagame because it was just all Jacks. Although that's also looking at the weakness in the metagame, right? If the weakness in the metagame is that everything's a Jack, then the answer is find the X5 bodies. So it kind of, and that's the point, right? Is that you shouldn't look at just one thing, right? This is looking at both trying to find the weakness in the metagame as well as just putting a bunch of good cards together.
Yeah, I think a good highlight of when we had a meta that was just good cards was when it was the FTP and Winchest meta. It's been a while now, probably about 2 years or a year and a half by now, right? But I think that's one of the metas people really highlight of good cards at its peak. You had the FTP, or it wasn't Moment, always, but Genève, playing Fire Time Primal, Equivocate, Heart of the Vault, Permafrost Torch, Merchants, just the ability to generate card advantage and effectively answer opponents' threats. That was the most prime time for good cards metagames, I think, and a good place to highlight good cards.
And a lot of people were playing those types of decks, the Genève and Winchester decks, and I think something worth highlighting is the decks that did well were the ones that were the most efficient. And I top 8'd the Winchester Breakout tournament, the ECQ, and one of my big things was making sure that I was lowering the curve a little bit and putting power in the market to make sure that I could deploy all of my powerful cards in a timely manner.
Yeah, I agree. When everyone is shooting on that to fight on the axis of effectiveness, making sure you're efficient in doing so that you're the one in control of deciding when these cards get played and when they need to come out in time, then you just control the matchup and you can make their good cards into bad cards because they're not able to play them at the right time. Things like that.
That's also what I did with the Xenon deck, and that's that same metagame. Right, my Xenon deck, I thought we just went like right under both the both the FTP and the Winchester, right? If they're playing a bunch of 6-drops, I'm gonna play a bunch of 4-drops that do roughly the same amount of damage, but a little bit sooner, and then I can go over them with my sights to kill their 6s. But the other example of a good cards deck, the most we haven't really seen it recently, but decks with Zolta Arcanum have traditionally followed under this good cards category as a sort of more recent version of the same deck idea. And I do like a Zolta Arcanum because it has fun implications. Are there any other common recent good card deck lists, or I know everyone complains about the fact that there's so many good cards, like, oh, everything's just good cards in the deck. But it looks like there hasn't actually been that many good card decks in a year and a half, right?
Well, I mean, Argenport also, I think.
Sure, Argenport, yeah, I guess.
Be a good card deck. I think Mono Shadow would be also if it was a good deck.
If it was good. You can't say a bad deck counts.
If it had enough good cards to be good card the deck.
I mean, you can't say a deck that doesn't work is a good cards deck.
But I'm not talking about the current format with Ikaria. I'm talking about the previous format with like Cast into Shadow, and like this was after the Xenon Expedition. Yeah. I mean, it was barely Argenport. It was basically a Mono Shadow deck.
Yeah, I guess.
So one important thing, especially when playing these good card decks, your cards are better than your opponent, so you just need to deploy them in a timely manner. I think that is the key to these types of decks, is power efficiency. And you want to make sure that you're not stuck with cards that you can't play in your hand. You want to make sure that you're doing something every turn. You can't just take the first 3 turns off and expect to win a game. You have to start doing stuff, interacting with the board early on. Yes, you can often take 1 turn off, but you don't want to take turn after turn off playing Wisdom of Elders into Honor of Claws. You probably aren't providing enough pressure, or you're probably not interacting with your opponent's pressure enough to win those types of games. I think a good example of this is the Genev deck. We mentioned Genev earlier, that Noverb took to the finals of an ECQ that collector won. He was playing my 80 cards, the same 80 cards as I was playing, and one of my big things in that deck was moving Zalchi to the market, a 7-drop to the market, moving a power to the market, and taking out Wisdom Elders, because that deck was already crushing its opponents on the card axis. You didn't need to go further down that line. You're already playing Heart of the Vault, and you're already playing Howling Peak. So you're already crushing your opponent on the card axis. It's just a matter of not dying on the efficiency axis. And I think that, just being able to deploy your cards is a big part of that, and how you construct your deck, how you set up the power costs in your deck is a really big part of that. So, I mean, whenever you're building a deck, you should have a game plan of on turn 2, I'm going to do this. On turn 3, I'm going to do this. Now on turn 4, I'm going to do this. And what you do on turn 3 should be more powerful than what you do on turn 2. And what you do on turn 4 should be more powerful than what you do on turn 3.
So the turn cycle scenario is why I said that you don't want to have 51 drops in your deck unless you're trying to do some sort of insane batteries trick. but you don't want 51 drops in your deck, because you really want to have those 1 drops early. But once it comes like turn 4, only going to lose a lot of effectiveness, and that's where you want your decks, right? So you want to make sure that your deck is balanced. Even when you're super aggressive, you still want to have balance. You still want to not have only 1 drops. You want to have a mixture. You want to have a lot of 1 drops to be able to do things early, to get those efficient early turns. But you want to have enough cards to function late in the game to allow you to ride yourself to victory, instead of stalling out on 1 drops only and then not being able to close the game out.
Yeah, so I think that playing 2 1-drops is more powerful than playing a 2-drop for the most part, but you'll run out of cards quickly that way, and you won't be able to keep on going. So you want to have an ideal play to make on turn 2, especially in the developing stages of the game. You want to have a play you're looking to make on turn 2, on turn 3, on turn 4, etc. You're not always going to hit everything on time in every game. That's just not realistic. But having that plan, I think, goes a long way in order to maximize how well you can develop in the early game. So people talk about power curve a lot, and I think it's pretty common knowledge that you really want to have a variety of power costs on your cards. I mean, you want to have some things that cost 1, some things that cost 2, some things, etc. You don't actually need things that cost 1 in some decks, But generally speaking, you want to have the most of cards that cost 2, 3, or 4, and you don't want to overload on cards that are too expensive or too cheap. You don't want to be playing, 7 drops. That's just, you're not going to be able to play them. It's just not realistic to happen.
Yeah, I think that kind of falls back on like where I was trying to talk about, like, your deck should still be thinking about all the axes, and you might be working primarily on one axis, but you still kind of need to keep the other axis in mind, the other axes in mind.
Yeah, you only need to win on one axis, but on the other hand, you can't lose on any of them immediately, because then you lose.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I think a really important thing to notice or to pay attention to here is when you're actually playing the card as far as its cost goes. So like there are a lot of 1-cost cards that you can't actually play on the first turn, or cards potentially cards that cost 2 that don't really cost 2. And the biggest example of this is Predator's Instinct, and I call this the Predator's Instinct trap. So back when Grodov Stranger was big, people loved to play Grodov Stranger into Predator's Instinct and draw 2 cards immediately. But I think something that people overlooked a lot of the time, that's a very powerful combo, is I think people viewed Predator's Instinct as a card that cost 1 instead of a card that cost 7. And what I mean by that is
a card that costs 6.
6, yes, sorry. And what that means is that you could have a hand that is, say your hand is just 4 Predator's Instinct, 4 Grodov Stranger. You're doing nothing until turn 6. If you're stuck on 4 power and you draw that 5th power, you still can't do anything. Another example of this is Xenon Initiation. I guess that's a very similar one. I should come up with something better. Maybe Evolution, Accelerated Evolution. It says it costs 2 now. Now it says it costs 2, but it doesn't really cost 2 because you can't play it until you have a unit that's already in play. So I think when you have decks that are trying to play cards like Combust or cards that are like Devour, you shouldn't use these cards to you shouldn't have these cards count toward your curve. You need to make sure that you have better plays available for the early turns of the game, or to fill out your development stage of the game, in order to make sure that you're not losing on the efficiency axis.
Another version of this is cards with Spellcraft, right? If you look at just the pure cost of a card with Spellcraft, like Lindrise Codex, you look at it's like, oh, it costs 4, and yeah, yes, you can play it as 4, and win some games off of that flying effect. But for the most part, cards like Lindrise Codex, to a lesser extent, Grodov Burden, Burden actually costs 5 a lot of time if you need to, but like Codex, right, really costs 7, right? You don't want to be playing it for its 4 cost effect. So another example is you gotta look at the text of cards, right? So like cards with Spellcraft or Amplify. I don't think many of those see constructed play, but cards like that sort of hide their mana cost, right? Jack is another example of this, right? Jack's like, oh, if you look at it on like Eternal Warcry, it's like, wow, I have a bunch of 3-drops, but Jack isn't really a 3-drop. Jack is a 4-drop.
Yeah, I think people might have fallen into that trap with Stone Scar too. I looked at some of these lists and it'd be like 12 to 16 4-drops, but they would have Jack and Milos. So technically they have 3s, but yeah, it looks like they have 3s, but
that's a good example of someone falling into this trap in an actual deck list.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a trap I've seen happening quite often with Stone Scar, if we're to reference a deck that people are maybe falling into the trap with.
All right, so make sure that your cards, you're aware of what turn you can play your cards, and if all these cards are backloaded too much, you might lose, you might not be able to compete on the efficiency axis early on in the game, and you can get run over. The last thing, which kind of ties into this, is that you should always be conscious of what plays you're making that impact the board and what don't. So the curve of Strategize and Wisdom of Elders into Honor of Claws, yeah, that's a card that costs 2, into a card that costs 3, and a card that costs 4, and all these cards are good, but none of them impact the board. None of them have any they're not going to block that 2-1 attacker that's coming at you or put pressure on your opponent's site. And I think in Eternal in particular, with relic weapons and sites and just how quickly you can die to incoming units, I think it's incredibly important to fight over the board early on, and or at least have the ability to. If you have all these effects, even if they're powerful and they just don't interact with what's coming at you or put pressure on your opponent, that's a recipe recipe for disaster. So really make sure that you're balancing out these effects. I think Iplongo's deck from this past weekend has a few removal spells, but a lot of the early plays that it was counting on, like Transpose, Beseech the Throne, Wisdom of the Elders, Forbidden Research, there was a lot of stuff that wasn't able at impacting board. And I mean, those turns matter. Like if your opponent is doing stuff for 4 turns and you're just spinning your wheels, you could be in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, you don't have only those. Throw in your annihilates, throw in your defiances. Make sure you have, and your control decks. Make sure you have a balance. Now, a lot of these this conversation has mostly been about sort of like mid-range combo and aggro decks, because I think that's where the three of us have most of our deck building chops in. But there are some important things in control here. The balance of control, right? That's the difficult part to control. Is you have to balance being able to draw the cards to get your card advantage while not dying, basically.
Yeah, and just a tip about control decks. I think that it's easy to think of control decks in terms of card advantage, when really I think it's worth thinking of control decks in terms of effectiveness.
Yeah, you have to be. You can't just fight on the axis of cards. You need to be thinking about the other axis, either in terms of your opponent beating you on that axis, and then so maybe you need to be more considerate of that axis with your deck. Maybe you're leaning too heavy on cards and not enough on efficiency, and so because of that, your opponent is going to beat you on efficiency every time. So you need to kind of give a little weight to the other axes in order to make your deck actually win.
But the point of card draw is to draw more cards. What is the point of Helio but to draw more Helios? There's no winning here. There's just card draw.
That's why you just play Tota Circle, because you're forced to actually play units in order to draw cards, and you impact the board.
In Tota Circle is that your units are 0/1, so they can't do anything anyways.
Until they kill you.
All right, that'll do it for our big discussion on building the tournament-winning deck list. Hopefully that was helpful. I know there's a lot of thoughts in there, and it's there's a lot of thoughts in there.
A topic that could always be expanded upon.
If anything didn't make complete sense, and I think that there's a lot of stuff that we said that has some assumption on where you stand for Eternal in order for it to make sense, like whether it be the deck list we're talking about or the cards we're talking about or what certain terms mean, feel free to reach out. I'm sure that any of us will be happy to answer your questions, or the Friends of Eternal Discord is there, and I'm sure that lots of people can help clarify things for you.
And if you're ever like, hey, I think that this topic that you talked about for like 5 minutes in the cast, let's have more of an expansion of that. Mention that too. If you just don't need like a clarification on a term, but rather like, hey, let's expand X topic. Like having ideas for future casts is always beneficial. Keep in mind. So on that axis, you can mention it too.
All right, finally, the last thing I wanted to talk about today is organized play. I mean, we always try to keep everyone up to date with regards to what is going on in the world of competitive Eternal, and this past weekend was the Summer Challenge, and Batteriez won it, as you may have heard somewhere.
If not everywhere.
So congratulations again, Batteriez. You won, of course, with your Rats deck, and I know that you would love the opportunity to tell us lots and lots and lots about it. So go ahead. The microphone is yours.
Anytime to talk about rats.
How many QCPs do you have now? You just got 75 off the tournament. So are you at like 150 QCPs? Like how many did you have?
135 is where I'm currently sitting.
Nice. You can get 2 buys. You can get 6 buys, right? That's how that works, right, Sonny? Anyways, I'll give you the floor, Batteriez. Talk to us about how awesome rats are and what their history is.
Oh man, all about rats. Well, I could talk about rats for hours, so I'll start with just like the brief history. It was about 2 years ago when I first made rats, and it kind of started off as a meme. I was just like, I wanted to meme around with Reanimator, and I wanted to play Severin plus Rat Cage and be able to discard with Prixis, and then Severin was like another way to like get multiple recursions like a Zindel. And then I started to realize that maybe Rat Cage plus Relics is just real on its own, and started working on like a basic relic list, and then eventually kept working on that, and then worked with the Bizarre Stampede WinCon, and then that deck actually did really well in an ECQ. I played it. Stormblessed, did you play rats
I did.
in that ECQ as well?
I helped tune that deck extensively. I helped convince Batteriez to remove Prixis from like 4-2 to 0. I was like, just get it out of there. And then I was the only one who took the deck that did not do well. Actually, I had a less than 50% win rate that tournament, but I was the only one.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, yeah. There was someone else, I wish I could remember who else it was, but they brought it to top 32. I think I only made top 16, or maybe it was top 32. The other person made top 16, and then Collector hit top 4, or was it top? No, he hit he took second in that.
Yeah, he got second.
ECQ.
He became the Rat King. Although I guess actually you reclaimed the Rat King throne because you've won a tournament with rats now. He just got second place.
Yeah, there we go. So he took that list to second in ECQ, and then ever since then, I've just absolutely loved the deck. I really like playing around with relics in general, just because I feel like kind of a niche card type that people aren't willing, or there's strong cards that defeat them. And I've just kind of been working on that over the past couple of years. Recently, I think it's been pretty decent in the meta. Just like the interaction that it has between like Equivocate and Display of Knowledge. Granted, sometimes you want to use the Display of Knowledge for finding a rat cage, but the fact that it can be flexed as a removal that gets past Entombs, puts the unit back at the bottom of the deck was really good. Just the whole flexibility of rats I really enjoy. Like, you're playing a lot of different relics, but like, it's either you have a couple units that create relics. Your relics generally have like a removal attached to them: Pitfall Trap, Curator Spear, Quiver, and then so you're kind of just creating this snowball effect that I really love to play with, as well as kind of being like combo based, where you develop a bunch of unique relics and rats, and then you beat them up with Stampede and just win on turn 5 randomly.
So you mentioned that it started out as a meme deck. What was the turning point to being like, oh, this is a deck that we can play at tournaments? Was that when Stormblessed told you to remove the Prixises, or was it sometime before that?
Yeah, it was about that time, because it started off as the meme reanimator list, and then I was like, okay, well, Rat Cage is feeling pretty real with Pitfall Trap and Courtier and Severin, and that feels powerful as its whole. So let's take that and then like focus on units that can create relics. Initially, it had Teacher of Humility instead of Cryptic Master way back in the day, because Cryptic Master didn't exist, and Teacher of Humility was also a 3/3 then, and just really good.
And Teacher of Humility makes a rat. It makes a rat when it attacks.
Yeah, and then so like then it just kind of noticed, right? Because you're playing all these relics that you're playing Pitfall Trap and Curator Spear, and so you're fighting on this axis of like creating this snowbally engine of effectiveness, but at the same time you're also putting value on the board and kind of fighting efficiency in that manner, like to a degree. If you have to have like certain cards in play, right? Like Rat Cage increases your efficiency, Lethrai Courtier increases your card advantage. Your effectiveness would come from like different relics and what they do, but if you assemble enough of the pieces, it starts fighting on axes really strongly, and I think that was like the turning point. Like, oh, this deck has the ability to beat other decks that fight on these axes just by assembling a couple pieces.
I would also argue that it never really stopped being a meme until very recently, until like the last expansion. I would say that it was a meme even back then. The fact that Collector took it to the ECQ and got second was only because he already won an ECQ, that he was willing to take a meme to the ECQ.
I don't know. I've always thought it was real because I've always been a believer in the rats, so I've always thought it was real since then.
So anyways, talk to us about updating rats for this tournament, or with the new expansion in general. Like, Silexes were a big deal of the new rats process, but how was it tuning let's say the rats list for the metagame? How was it, like taking a deck list and trying to tune it for this current metagame? Like, what was that process like?
So the process for that is, so you're running this relic package and you're trying to create this snowball effect. What relics and what cards can contribute to that, while still keeping the core strategy in place? For example, Porcelain Mask. I knew Xenon Reanimator was going to be really big, and is really big in this meta. So having Porcelain Mask as a relic to, proc Lethrai Courtier or Rat Cage, and then also silence a Merchant in the Reanimator's hand, or a Vera or an Azindel or a Katra. Really important targets that if you can silence them, you start disassembling their game plan. I used to play Pause for Reflection before this tournament in meta, in rats because it kind of had been a more controlling meta. So having that ability to either interact with aggro in some way, while also not being dead removal against these super hard control decks, and the ability to like rebuy a rat cage or another relic or rebuy an effect. And I swapped those for permafrost since Stone Scar aggro, people always play Stone Scar aggro, and there wasn't like a lot of control in the format, it felt like. So I removed the pause from reflections in favor for permafrosts. As far as set 9 goes, Silexes were just absolutely amazing for rats. It got 8 copies of Silex in it, which is just insane. That kind of let me cut out like Vault of the Praxis or other ways to generate card advantage in rats, because you can just generate it off of your mana base for basically free. And then there were variants that had Curtain Call in them, but Curtain Call got nerfed, and casting it for 3 in rats isn't very appealing, because rats does want to fight on that axis of efficiency. Like every relic in the deck costs 2 or less, not only for Swindler, but also so that you can deploy your relics out fast enough to actually gain an advantage from them and use that advantage. And then there was Desert Alchemist, which solid card. You don't want to run too many because it only is like removal as well as like kind of fixing with its plunder aspect. But it's still a unit, and the deck kind of struggles with unit count sometimes. So it was able to fill multiple roles there. So I ran a couple of those.
When you say struggle with unit count, you mean has too many units or too few?
Too few units, actually, which isn't something that I think people usually have an issue with in most decks. If you're playing hard control, you don't usually care about your unit count. You're trying to make it as low as possible. Or if you're playing mid-range, you're fighting the problem of like too many units generally. But the deck only has... See, if you count Rat Cage, it's like 3, 2, 4, 4, and then Crack the Earth. It's pretty low on units. If you don't play a Rat Cage, you generally don't have a board.
So one thing I noticed is a notable exclusion from the deck that was in former Rat list is that you are not running the Elysian Smuggler in this list. What would you care to talk to slightly about your market choices and why you chose to exclude a potentially 4/4 for 3 cost Smuggler that also gets to go to your market?
Oh, right. That fights along the efficiency line. The change for that, Crack the Earth is 1 cost, 1 market X. It still gives you a body. And granted, you weaken your market options a lot by only being able to play 5 costs. Like even the current market, I'm still not sure about playing Crystallize or what the 5th slot should be, honestly. It's kind of hard in that respect to find the best 5-drop card for it. But because it's so efficient at what it does, you can access the market for 1 rather than for 3. You're fighting on that axis of efficiency. You want to be able to kill the opponent by turn 5 with a Bizarre Stampede when offered. And Great Valley Smuggler, while being a great unit in terms of effectiveness, being a 4/4 for 3 that accesses the market, it's not as efficient and doesn't allow you to deploy your game plan as fast. As well as Crack the Earth also having access to Arc of Soul, which ramps you up power and gives you more efficiency.
That's a really interesting aspect of the deck, right? Like your market options aren't as good with Arc of Soul, and the card that you get off of it isn't as good as the 4/4 that you have off of the Smuggler, but it still ends up being a better card for the deck because it works toward your game plan in a way. Like it frees up power that you could use to work toward that game plan, right?
Yeah, exactly. As well as potentially generate you more power to be more effective in other turns because you have more power to play with.
Turn 1, Crack the Earth into opponent plays depleted power into Arc of Soul is just so stupid. I hate it.
It's so strong. And then you follow up and you're like, okay, turn 4 Swindler into Rat Cage, and off to the races we go. You're on 3 power still.
At least they nerfed Arc of Soul so you can't turn 2 Arc of Soul and play something else in the same turn.
You mean turn 2 play Rat Cage and then sacrifice the rat instead.
The rat, yeah, that would that can block.
That was one of my favorite lines. Ooh, I loved it so much.
I've always been so impressed by the just like flow of cards that Courtier brings to the deck, and like the predictability of it, the fact that you always get power and it's always power from the top of your deck, I think really plays into how powerful that engine is. And I mean, Courtier is one of my favorite cards. I just never figured out how to use it before this Rats deck came along.
The combination of Courtier and Pitfall Trap is actually ridiculous. And even with Silex, the addition of Silexes makes that engine even crazier too, right? Because now you're drawing random power for your deck, and that power can create card draw too. So not only are you getting power to play over your turns, you're also getting these troves. And then if you have a Pitfall Trap as well, say you're making Rats with it as well, let's just assume, because this is a scenario that happens very often with Rats. Having Display of Knowledge and Swindler to tutor for one of the two missing pieces, right? You start cycling either this power that doesn't generate troves, or you start playing these Silexes, which generate troves, and then you can pay one to cycle the troves and get even cheaper card draw. And you turn this power into just a powerful engine, and the loots that you're getting as well off these Pitfall Traps generally aren't going to be power because you've drawn enough power from the top of your deck. And so that plays a very big role in how this deck is able to grind through decks that traditionally fight in terms of effectiveness and cards. Getting a Courtier out and if a Courtier stays on board, you're probably in really big trouble against Rats if you're not beating them in a couple turns.
So we mentioned that aggro decks are what you struggled against, or what what wasn't present, which allowed you to play Rats, right? What are the decks that you're most happy to see when you're playing Rats?
Right now, the decks I'm most happy to see are the decks that try to be aggro decks in the format. I've been talking about how I don't think most Stone Scar builds I've seen recently are very good because they're not good enough at killing the opponent on turn 5 or applying enough pressure where they can squeeze out a win in later turns. Rakano also, they're not trying to necessarily, they can kill you sometimes by turn 4 or 5 with high rolls. But generally they're building up an influence base to build up on these cards, and these big powerful plays they're trying to make with these more expensive cards get blown out by Equivocate or Display of Knowledge. And so it becomes very easy to just poke them with Rats, get them to make bad blocks, get efficiency with your Pitfall Traps, your Quivers, and then when they try to make that big blowout play, you're just like, okay, Equivocate or Display of Knowledge, and goodbye you go. Even Control wasn't too bad for the most part, though. I think the deck there were very few decks I was concerned about playing in this challenge event. The Fire Justice Primal was kind of those can always be a little sketchy to play against Rats because they have sort of that way to fight. They can wipe the board multiple times. They have a bunch of attachment hate, so they can kind of try to disassemble. Generally, they're a little bit too slow to do so you still beat them up, but they can be a little scary sometimes. Or Reanimator was the big one. Other combo decks that can play Blight Moth, slow you down, and then combo off with Talir or a big board of reanimated targets. I think those were the biggest fear for me, or someone playing a really good Stone Scar list.
Were you worried about Mono Fire?
No, Mono Fire is usually not too much of a concern for me because they play a lot of X1s and X2s generally, and you get to eat up X1s and X2s as a Rats player with Pitfall Trap and Quivers, or market for Jotun Hurler, swapping the Jotun Hurler back in to grab your Swindler, and you start snowballing things. There's a lot of ways to eat up tiny units. A bunch Stone Scar, a good Stone Scar deck is probably what I feared the most. Yeah. Good Stone Scar piloted by a good player is what I feared the most because they have a lot of X3s. They can kill you by turn 4 or 5. And if they're not blocking Rats, you struggle to pick up their X3s. Yeah, I was scared of Jocked. Yeah. I didn't want to get Jocked this tournament.
It's kind of sad because the deck used to be so cheap. It used to be such a good free-to-play deck, and then Makar's Quiver came out, and now the deck's just so much more expensive. Still worth investing into. You potentially replace Makar's Quiver with some other, option. The deck will get worse without Makar's Quiver, but it is, if you are a new player, this is a really good cheap deck that can, without Makar's Quiver, it costs 20,000 Shiftstone. It's really cheap.
Yeah, without Makar's Quiver, I think Makar's Quiver is the only legendary in the deck. So without that, it is very affordable deck.
All right, so that was this past weekend. Batteriez took it down with Rats, let's talk about what else is going on in organized play. And all we can say is that we know that there's an ECQ coming up. We know that there's going to be the summer championships coming up. We know that the draft's coming up. We have no dates for any of these.
Oh, we know when the challenges are, the championships, right?
Do we? We just know that they're after September 1st, right?
I have struggled with the lack of information we have regarding the dates of these events for months now, to the point where I don't even look for the dates and just wait for the week of potentially an event happening to find it when it's going down.
I assume that all events are at least 2 weeks out, because I think that we haven't had a time where like say ECQ has been announced and then it's been like, less than a week before the day of the actual tournament. I think it's always been at least 2 weeks. So I'm assuming that it's going to be at least 2 weeks out, if not more.
Editing Sunyveil stepping in here just to say, well, so much for that sentiment. The most recent ECQ was this past weekend, with just 1 week's notice before it started. And yeah, that's what happened with that. All right, back to the cast.
Although I guess if I could be wrong, because we just don't know, but I'm assuming that it's going to be end of August, for the next ECQ, and then in September for the championships is my assumption.
Yeah, I think that's the rough timeline that we're expecting, although being in the business of letting people know when these tournaments are can be pretty tricky when we don't know ourselves. Yeah. So if anyone from Direwolf is out there, if you could give us a tournament schedule, we'd really appreciate it.
I guess you could deduce that there is going to be an ECQ probably on the 28th, right? We haven't had an ECQ this month, so unless they made an announcement on Friday that it was going to happen the 21st, and only gave us 1 week of prep time, which it hasn't not happened recently. If it hasn't happened recently, then I think you can deduce that it's probably going to happen on the weekend of the 28th. But
yeah, the 28th makes sense to me. The one that really we have no idea about, because like the 28th for the ECQ, and then like early September, probably like September, like 11th or something. Not September 11th. Like early September, makes sense for the championships. But the one we don't know about at all is the draft tournament. That's the one that we have like literally no idea when that could be.
Just a quick note from editing Sunyveil, in case you didn't already catch it at the beginning of our show, the draft tournament will be this weekend, August 28th. But I'm leaving this in here just to illustrate that at time of recording, we really had no idea. And I really wish that, we knew these things further out in advance so we don't look like idiots when we try to release podcasts.
But yeah, Direwolf, I assume that they're working somewhat on trying to get us towards having a schedule of some description, and I hope that they are successful in pushing that out sooner than later.
Also, when will we find out about these wildcard slots? Speaking of not knowing about the draft
Scion draft tournament. Yeah, that's what I always been saying. I want a Scion draft tournament for one. That's what I want.
All right, Batteriez, you stream. Tell us about your stream and when it is.
You can catch me at Batteriez twitch.tv/BatteriezECG. I've been streaming a lot lately without a specific schedule. It's generally after 10 o'clock Central Standard Time if it hasn't happened earlier in the day. If it happens earlier in the day, sometime in the afternoon. I haven't got a stream schedule set up yet, but hopefully soon. For now, you'll just have to click the notifications and catch me when I'm live.
Check out Batteriez, the Ratmaster. Well, that'll do it for today. Thank you so much for joining us, Batteriez. It was a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you for having me. I've always been wanting to be on the podcast, so it was wonderful to be a guest on the podcast. So
of course you deserve it for taking home the tournament with the Rats. Anyways, so that'll be it for this week, 2 weeks of FECast. Very important topic, and I think we delved pretty heavily into in a relatively short time frame. So I hope you all enjoyed, and until next time, you'll see us in the friend zone.
The Friends of Eternal Discord is the best place on the internet to get better at Eternal. We have players of all skill and experience levels all happy to help each other out on basically any aspect of their Eternal gameplay. And making all this possible is our generous patrons over at patreon.com. If you'd like to support FECast or Friends of Eternal, consider donating at patreon.com/Friends of Eternal. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, we'll see you in the friend zone.